Cool. Thank you so much to Howard and Veronica and Debbie for inviting me. I really appreciate that. It's always good to have got the community guidance ahead of time, because it is going to be an element of spiciness here, but it will be within within the boundaries of what should be done. So don't you can stay clear of the big red button, Howard. Just
Okay.
Don't worry about that. Cool. So my name is Simon Stewart. Howard did a bit of an introduction, which I appreciate. I'm one of the principal consultants, or as I just changed my job title to forward deployed engineer because it sounds so much cooler.
Right.
And I get the privilege of being able to jump around between a lot of our clients and look at trends, help them with trends, kind of guide them in decisions, and kind of dive in and do some sort of high impact work, which is really cool. And what that means is, it means that I've been able to see a lot more than I would have if I was in a project for 6 months or at a client for 12 months. And that gives me an opportunity to see some trends and see where I think things are going. As I'm sure a lot of us are doing on the call, we try our best to keep up to date. I think anyone that says they are up to date has missed the last 6 months of movement. And I did this talk at DataFest, which I think was about 2 months ago, and there's been various kind of changes in the industry since then, so I had to update it, which is good. I think for me, it's kind of part of the reason to be in the industry, is you get to kind of be in full panic mode the whole time, which works for some people and doesn't work for others. So as Howard alluded to, the idea with this talk is certainly not me kind of dictating this is how things are and this is what I think and this is kind of the direction everything's going, but more to share what I'm seeing and a trend that I think is going to kind of be kind of paved ahead of us. I'd love to be. It's never going to be 100% right, so I'm more than happy to kind of get input as we go. There's obviously a bit of a slide at the end to kind of foster a bit of debate. So feel free to disagree. This is kind of taking a stab at what I think is happening. It's not going to be an all or nothing. It's going to be a combination of things. But I'm really interested to hear what's happening in the different industries. So this is about where I think analytics is heading. And I think it's going to be more, the end result is going to be more of a conversation than the sort of typical dashboard that we all used to. So an analogy that I always go back to, and I guess it's not an analogy if it actually happened. I grew up in PE, and this goes back to, not to give away my age, but this goes back to the 80s and whenever it was. I remember there was, I used to spend a lot of time at the beach, which is very grateful in hindsight to have done when I was growing up. And one of the things that we would always do to check the condition of the surf, whether it was to go paddle skiing or go diving or whatever it was, is someone had taken their answering machine, for those that remember what an answering machine was. And instead of phoning and leaving a message, the person's message was the condition of the surf, which is such a cool, I'm going to use the word sort of hack. It's not really a hack, but I mean, it's misusing something in a way that actually makes it probably far more useful than it was intended. And I think, honestly, what the tools that we've got available today are really encouraging us to do incredibly cool things. And so often what happens is we get stuck in bureaucracy and meetings and things like that before we can actually innovate and do something cool. So this is really empowering from a distance and say, like, use the tools that we've got available and actually do something amazing for your team or your business. I really think that things have changed so much, again, even in the last 6 months, that we've got tools we just didn't have 6 months ago, and we can do things that really would have taken a year to do, we can now do in a week, and that's a crazy situation to be in. So how did we, Howard, is that?
I've been reading a lot on a few of the AI people, and I think today someone mentioned that they were able to build a Claude skill that was trading on the stock market, that is treats ahead of all of the other traders. They have those yearly competitions. I don't know if you saw the announcement, but I mean, that must be doing a lot of analytics and analysis of the market data. And is this sort of, to an extent, what is now capable? We don't need all of that special analysis or interaction. We can build it with tools like Claude to achieve what we're wanting to do.
Yeah, exactly. I thankfully don't have a huge need for an automated stock market bot, but I can see the benefit for some people.
Right.
So how did we get here? Like, in terms of an industry, we've gone from sort of paper-based reports, sort of TPS reports for the office space fans, all the way to electronic formats of that, and potentially all the way to chatbots, which is where we're going to head in this talk. And I think that transition is from paper, where we received the truth in a paper format, to Excel, where we could go and edit the truth and kind of make it what we needed it to be, to some kind of business intelligence dashboard where we can kind of refresh the truth as much as we need until we get the results that we want. And I believe where we're heading is a situation where we can start discussing the truth with some kind of automated system. And for me, I think that's far more important, that movement from receiving something to editing something to refreshing something to being able to discuss something. That's the migration for me that's more important than the actual kind of widgets on a screen and the actual technology involved. It's being able to get to a point where you can start having this kind of Socratic conversation with this thing, and for it to then guide you in what you need to know and kind of when you need to know it. And it's a matter of moving the information closer to the user, which is something we all do in whatever kind of department of computer science, in a branch of computer science we're in, trying to move information closer to the user. But I think it's also to do with moving the user closest to being able to make a decision. And it's that movement that's quite a lot more difficult than just showing kind of widgets on a screen. Being able to actually guide them in the decision and actually make sure that they trust that decision and that decision makes sense, and it's not kind of going off the proverbial sort of garden path, following a language model somewhere. I don't think the dashboards themselves are going to go away, just to kind of give you the punchline of the talk right in the beginning. But I do think that final mile of kind of shifting the decision point from something sort of paper-based that's dumped on a desk to something where a user can have a lot more of an engagement with. And I think it's around helping the user ask better business decisions, and that will then guide them into making better decisions for the business. And it's going from a job title point of view, it's going from asking people to be report writers. I think that was probably my first job, is doing report writing in Crystal reports, which, nothing against Crystal reports. I mean, it is what it is. But that was very much, here's the data, kind of dump it on screen, and some exec down the line will potentially see it. To far more of a sort of Bieber job title, this business intelligence, business analyst combination. And that's certainly something that we're seeing in the market a lot more, is we're not seeing people getting roles as pure report writers anymore. It's becoming this far more sort of embedded role, where someone needs to understand the analysis and understand how things are going to be displayed. And it's not just moving widgets around the screen. And I think that potentially is something that all of us are going to see in all of our roles, is a sort of a blending from all sides. Let me move on. So I've covered a little bit around what we're seeing. I do think that the dashboard problem is not actually to do with dashboards. It's rather to do with the actual functionality we're offering to a user, the actual ability to help them get to a business decision. And that's something that quote is made up, by the way, but I mean, it's an indicative quote that we see in a lot of clients, where they don't necessarily want another dashboard, even if they're asking for it, but they need something to help them make a decision. And that's something that we are seeing in the market. We're also seeing that a lot of dashboards, and I'm saying dashboards here, you can think of it as a report. It's really the same thing. We're seeing a huge number of them. Howard, don't you want to help me with mute?
Yeah, I'm actually looking for the person that's not on mute.
One of your wayward members is off mute. What we're seeing is a lot of dashboards that are getting made are not actually getting used. William, I can see a question.
Yeah, on my side, I agree with your statement, help me make a decision. But I think there's a part there, and help me not to get myself into trouble when I'm doing so. I think that's like a hidden thing, and everybody's kind of saying, but they're not saying it. And I think that's the scary part that we've got to somehow find a way to make people comfortable about, because if we can't help them to feel, okay, I'm not going to get persecuted for making this decision. That's the real kind of dusty area that we're in at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I touch on aspects of it in a couple of slides, but I think that really is super important. Getting to the point that you can help a user make a decision is really easy. Helping them make a decision that actually makes sense for the business and uses the data that they've got in a meaningful way, that's really going to be the sweet spot into the future. I really think so. So just to back to those stats, we are seeing a lot of dashboards, a lot of reports are getting made that really don't seem to be used at all. It's one of the interesting things that I often mention to clients is they'll have Power BI is a big tool for generating dashboards. And what a lot of people don't know is you can actually look at metrics of the dashboards and kind of metrics of the metrics and see who's actually using the dashboards. And often those are metrics that the executives just don't want to see. Is what they want is they want a bunch of dashboards, but they don't necessarily want to know that they're not actually using them. Bit of a weird combination of stats there. And we're also seeing a lot of companies that are just not using the data that they've got. They're using a very small portion of it. And that speaks into a lot of the work that this organization does, is getting people to the point that they can make meaningful decisions on their data and figure out the governance of their data and kind of where all of that information is. And I think it's gone from one extreme to the other. It's gone from this concept of dark data, where we have really interesting data in our business, but we either can't find it or we can't make sense of it. And that's kind of overshot reality. And now we're potentially in a situation where we've got this dashboard graveyard, where we've got sort of the flavor of the month from Exco sitting in a list of reports somewhere that no one's ever seeing. And it's tricky to kind of get a sort of find the balance between those two extremes. But both of them we're seeing in abundance. It's that concept of dark data, where we've got really interesting data, but we don't know what to do with it, or we don't know what where it is, or how we would even make sense of it. And then we've got the other extreme of having kind of reports after reports after reports. And as always, the trick is to try and find the balance between the two. And I think what we've got, and I've kind of touched on this before, is the kind of the current state, where potentially you've got developers that are creating reports. So whether those are BI, BA people or business analysts or whatever the job title is, and all of them are getting this abundance of queries from management and from Exco to create report after report after report. And that's certainly something that we're still seeing in the market, and I think it's going to be around for a while. Is this the sort of long backlog of reports to be created? But what we are seeing elements of, and you would have seen it with a lot of the newer tools that are available to us, is starting to shift away from that to a bit more of a self-service, where you've got business users, for better or for worse, that can now easily generate reports, potentially easily generate apps based on some kind of data, and we'll get into what that sort of some kind of data is in a minute. And I'm not too sure for me where the comfort level is. For me, is it the way that things currently are being done, where you've got sort of management queuing up? Howard, go for it.
Yeah, sorry, not to interrupt. If you get to the end of your comment and question, I'll pick it up then.
No, go for it. Go for it, Howard.
Okay. So of course, when we first started with self-service reporting, everyone was jumping on that. And one of the things we quickly realized is that we needed to do some level of report curation. So if they build a report, how do we know that they've got the right level of quality and they've joined things properly and things like that? And so you go report curation. Now, my question is, if you now start going into like you had with the WhatsApp and an MCP type of thing, if we don't have a good control on the semantic model, how do we know that those visualizations are accurate? And how would we know that if someone makes a decision, on what numbers did they base that? How do you keep evidence of all of that as you flow?
Yeah, I really think that's the crux of it, and that's really I guess the sort of the punchline at the end is going to be we've got these really interesting tools that enable us to do these cool things where you can get business users can spit out sort of whole applications now just by talking to a prompt.
Yeah.
And we'll get into a couple of examples in a minute, but none of that's really useful other than a bit of a sort of vanity project if it's not based on real solid kind of foundational data. And having MCP servers that allow you to connect into your SAP or into whatever other system, I don't think that's actually that useful from an end user point of view. I think it's got to be far more of a curated, set of, whether it's a medallion architecture or it's whatever you're kind of going for. There's got to be a semantic model that these tools can dig into, and that is where a lot of us have work, is to make sure that this foundation of data can be pulled from different systems, can go through the various checks and balances that it needs, and it can get to a point where you've got this, whatever sort of methodology you follow, but you've got this kind of gold mart for the finance team or gold mart for the HR team. And it's really at that point that you can almost kind of unleash the AI for the end user, because at that point you know that the data is pretty simple, it's 100% verifiable, and you know that sort of provenance for that it has. So all of that still stands, just in case anyone was thinking I was going to suggest we all vibe code straight to our ERP system. So yeah, I've shown the sort of two extremes of what we're seeing in the market. And I do think that it's veering into this direction where you've got a lot more self-help, whether that's Xcode doing it or someone else, doesn't really matter. But the tools that we've now got available to us allow us to start heading in this direction. So what's driving that, and what are the tools that we're seeing getting used? None of this is an advert for any of these tools. They all of these vendors kind of play catch up with each other, so they're all very much overlapping. But we are seeing a combination of the low code and the more sort of high code or developer focused tools. And all of this presumes, and Howard kind of alluded to it, that you've got solid data structures behind the scenes. So let's presume that's in place. Power BI has been around a long time, but we are seeing, even within that ecosystem, we're seeing MCP servers that enable you to drive the Power BI desktop to scaffold out reports. We're seeing a shift from the PBIX file format to the PBIP. I think I've got those two the right way around, which all kind of lends itself more and more towards the AI tooling. AI doesn't really want to do any kind of binary. Well, it's ironic, I guess it does. It's always going to do binary, but it's not going to do binary output as a file format, which is interesting. I try to convince my my sales and recruitment team to use Markdown for something, but I'm not sure I won that argument. I think
Right.
Markdown does look a bit more binary for most humans than text. But you can understand why Markdown is the winner, because it's a lot more machine readable, and it's a lot easier and kind of cheaper for a machine to manipulate. And that's where the newer format of Power BI is going to come in. Again, because it's now just a folder structure with a bunch of text files. Makes it a lot simpler to go in and edit through some kind of chat interface. Fabric apps, we're also seeing a lot of uptake. Fabric is a little bit of a latecomer into the market compared to Databricks and Snowflake and others. It is a bit of a rebrand of some existing tools, but there's a bit more to it than that. But the Fabric apps is really interesting, where you've now got a developer framework which is very much sort of AI centric, and it enables you to really simply kind of spin up an app. It's very much a developer focused thing, but we're seeing a rise in that, where instead of having to go and create a dashboard, we can now create a fully featured sort of mini app based on that underlying curated set of data. Snowflake has got very similar tools. We've been huge fans of Streamlit for a long time. They're now very much part of the Snowflake family. But that's also from an ability to spin up a very quick, sort of a cheap and cheerful application based on that semantic layer. Streamlit's a great one for those that are Python fans and want to play around with that. And Databricks has got something similar as well. So all of the big vendors in the sort of data space are playing the same game. And for me, all of that speaks to, can I drive the development of a mini system or a mini app via some kind of agent? And the answer, certainly from a dev point of view, is 100% right. We're seeing a very similar thing on the business side, so the sort of low code, no code point of view, but the needs are a little bit different. I think often from a technical point of view, it's doing something to get the job done. And we've been empowered forever because we have the ability to dive in and kind of do whatever needs to be done. Whereas typically a business person always has had to go through IT in order to get something done. And we're seeing those walls getting broken down a bit. Because from the business point of view, what are the main drivers? It's the need to be empowered. They want to be able to dive in and kind of get their own answers. They typically have got the business knowledge, and that's often where that divide came in between technical, or between IT and business, is that business had the IP, whereas the IT department had the technical know-how. And we're seeing that kind of flatten out a little bit. And also from the business side is the ability for them to tailor something to their specific needs without having to go back and sort of ask again and ask again. And also from the business side is the ability to kind of do things ad hoc and make changes whenever they want without having to kind of go back into the queue and ask again. And we're seeing there's a lot of tools involved in that. I'm not going to go through them all, but the one interesting one we're seeing is around the ability to meet the user where they are. So things like Claude Tag or Teams bots or Slack bots or whatever you're using, we're seeing that as an enabler for business, not in and of itself, but as a kind of way of getting to where the business user is, and then enabling them to kind of get into more and more data behind the scenes. How that pans out for all of us, I'm not too sure. So where does Excel fit into all of this? Because Excel's been this glue between IT and business, and it gets used all over the place. And I think often Excel becomes this glue between disparate systems, between the business needs and the business SME knowledge, potentially a bunch of mysterious calculations that get added, and then that becomes the business-facing data. And it served its purpose, and it's a very good tool. But I do think it's often a high use of Excel is often a symptom of something in a team or in an organization. And that's something that I see more and more of. Doesn't mean that Excel is not a good tool, doesn't mean it shouldn't be used. But again, if people are using it to kind of fill the gaps of something, we are seeing that as a potential flag. And often it's a need for a business user to have their own data, their own way, and it's typically for themselves. And what that typically means is you don't share it on. It kind of gets used as a way to present data, and then you send it off to the board, or you screenshot it for something into a PowerPoint presentation or something like that. It doesn't feed into another system typically. It obviously can. You probably shouldn't be using it like that, but I mean it's often a dead end for the data, which is a pity, because then you get all this interesting sort of augmentation into the data. You put all this interesting business knowledge into it, and then it just ends at that point. William.
Yeah, one of the things I've seen people use Excel for is because it's repeatable. In other words, you can get your calculations in there, and you know whatever data you.
Sorry, William. Sorry, William.
Yeah.
You're very faint, and not many people can hear.
Okay. Better?
That's better. That's a lot better.
Okay,
Thank you.
Sorry about that. Thank you for telling me. What I've seen, a lot of people use Excel for, because it's repeatable. In other words, it is a static structure with its formulas and all the rest of it. It's very good as a data cleansing tool in terms of highlighting, oh, something happened with the data to come in here. When you've got us to a system that is also dynamic, in other words, not a structured thing, it's not as easy to see. Do you think maybe people are going to start using Excel as a bit of a data cleanser prior to actually going into your more dynamic systems?
So I think this is part of the issue that I've got with Excel is not the product itself. It's the fact that you can pretty much do anything you want in Excel. I don't think it's part of Excel anymore, but I do believe at one point there was a whole flight sim in Excel. I never actually saw it myself, so it might be an urban legend. But you can do so much stuff in it, but I don't necessarily think that you should. So to have Excel as kind of part of your pipeline, I don't think that's the right tool. I think there's sort of better, more fit for purpose tools for that. I just find that often what happens with Excel is there's a human is taking bits and pieces of data from disparate systems, kind of reassembling it, sort of reimagining it in an Excel spreadsheet, hoping they've kind of got everything right. And then that then becomes the source of truth, which isn't right, because as soon as you've got a human doing a bunch of things, there's always room for error.
No,
So
I
that's
agree
kind of
with you there. I agree with you there, and I think that the migration away from that is important. The challenge is if you've got people who are now going to be doing, inverted commas, self-service, they've got no way to truly understand that their data is correct unless they've got something that they're going to take it through. Now, if your entire pipeline is designed and you've got IDQ or something running data quality on every single piece of data, which is extremely expensive, that's great. But generally speaking, the person who's working in that particular part of the business has a good idea of what their data is supposed to look like. The problem is they need a structured system to constantly show the data in the same format so that it jumps out at them. That's a gap that we just don't really have a proper solution for at this stage. But anyway, open to suggestion.
We were all hoping you'd have a solution, William. I think we're speaking about the same thing. And again, the highlight here is not to take a stab at Excel. It's more just to say that it's often a symptom of missing systems and missing pipelines in a team or in an organization.
I completely agree with that.
There is the problem where lots of organizations share data using Excel. I mean, if you log on to a bank or a reserve bank website and you say, download this series, down it comes in Excel. So you'll still have that Excel sitting there, and it's always helpful to be able to validate that source.
Sure. So I think we've kind of covered a few of these items already. The issue really is when there's high consequence work being done in Excel. And I think for me that's the flag. So whether it's number of Excel spreadsheets or the number of people using Excel, the time in the app, whatever the metric is, for me the most important metric is whether it's a high consequence. If you've got clean data from a trusted ecosystem, and that's kind of where the majority of the audience would spend a lot of their time, is doing that trusted ecosystem. Then the fact that it goes into Excel and you're doing whatever you're doing has no consequence really, because it's the information that got in there is trusted and cleaned and deduplicated and whatever else. But if you've got a human being that's tying up a bunch of systems via Excel, I think that's a potential problem. And typically, and I mentioned this before, typically it ends at that human. They might screenshot something into a PowerPoint or something similar, but it's not like it necessarily feeds into another system and you get that flow of data. That's not really what Excel's designed for. And as soon as you got to the point where you're now emailing copies of an Excel spreadsheet around, it's you've got that tension, which I'm sure we've all seen. And there's always going to be this temptation to kind of fix a problem in Excel, but you don't really realize that it hasn't actually fundamentally fixed anything. You're just fixing your kind of your version of the data. And this last point is brought up a few times, and I think Howard brought it up, and maybe William is like, what happens to data provenance? Like, you can't just dump a bunch of stuff in Excel and have that be the source of truth. That's not going to fly come audit time. And that's again where where the proper data modeling behind the scenes need to kick in. If Excel happens to be that last mile before the user, that's not an issue, but it's just whether it becomes part of the sort of fundamental data pipelines that's an issue.
Yeah, you know what we did, which is really helpful to put brakes on the Excel thing, right? Is we made it a governance thing that any Excel that was used in any department, the manager of that department had to own that Excel spreadsheet. It had to be properly documented. It had to have an author, owner, and the accountability for its output. It had to sit on a business process, and it actually became like a little tool. And the idea was to then put it on a roadmap to migrate that functionality to a more permanent tool. But it meant that the little bits and pieces that you're referring to around Excel started to fade out because the manager simply got their knuckles wrapped every time something like that was found. And that's some way to kind of move it towards what you're referring to.
Yeah, William, I think there's a lot of options around Excel, and having that kind of system in place is a good option. So just in terms of the sort of migration, all of this is random data, by the way, just in case accidentally it's someone's name or something. So we've gone from a situation where we've got tabular data. We've gone into a situation where we've generated a bunch of dashboards that look really cool. And the suggestion is maybe the next step, or some combination of these things, but maybe a logical next step is going to be chatbots. This is something that we all use. I'm sure a lot of us use Claude or ChatGPT or others, and we're starting to use that more and more. I know for myself, I'm not using. We're not going to get into the decline of Stack Overflow over the years, but I'm not using those kind of sites anymore. And even within Google search, it's now very much becoming more and more of a language model or a chat style interface, as opposed to the more typical, here's the list of results. And I think chat as a way of communicating with the system is really powerful. I do think it can be really annoying for those that have ever tried to interact with a chatbot because your Uber Eats has arrived in the wrong city, or you're trying to communicate with a bank about something, and you evidently have got hold of a chatbot which hasn't identified itself, which I think will at some point become law. It can be really frustrating. So I don't think that a chatbot by definition is automatically going to be a better interface. But I do think the ability to start connecting the question that the user's got, the context that the system has got, the evidence that it's got, to kind of connect those two and help drive that user to some kind of useful action. I think it's those combinations of endpoints that's going to be really useful. I also think that the chatbot is not necessarily going to be the only interface. So is this going to be something that sits on the side of your reports and you can communicate with it? Like maybe. Is it going to be something that at some point the chatbot's going to sort of put its hand up and say, well, I can't help you, so you need to kind of go back to the old way of doing it? Not really sure. But I do think that at least part of the interface is going to be driven by some kind of chat interface. And none of this has got to do with tool choices. It doesn't matter what you use. This is a screenshot from a little sort of throwaway Teams agent. That isn't the point. I think it's more a philosophy or a way of doing business in an organization that I think is going to change. What would be really useful is to be able to communicate with something and have it give you useful data. In this case, sort of the irony of giving tabular data inside of a chat interface isn't going to escape anyone. But the idea is that instead of just pushing a report to a user, you can allow the user to ask questions, to either guide the specific data or guide how that data is pivoted. I think that's the area that we're going to head into. Is this going to be enough for an exec who wants to do some meaningful work and kind of scrub the data in some way? No, probably not. But you often find that the reason the exec wants to export to Excel is not because they really want to do it themselves. It's because the underlying functionality they get is not sufficient. So they're kind of defaulting to exporting to Excel so they can do pivots and kind of move some things around. And I think this can be where these kind of chat interfaces can be a lot more feature rich. And just showing data, kind of going back in some sort of tabular format is not that useful. I think being able to kind of blow it up a little bit and actually dig into some more specifics around what the user is looking at. And this is some sort of POC work that we've done into our CRM and our ATS system. So instead of just showing some tabular data, we can actually dig into more detail. You can see some trends over time. And there is going to be this sort of ejection button where you can say, I need to go into the record and look at something myself. Obviously, all of that you need to cater for. But I feel that this kind of more interactive way of communicating with the user is going to be certainly something we're seeing benefit of. And I think it's going to become more and more important. And someone mentioned it earlier around the sort of provenance of data. So we can show some sort of data to a user here, but the ideal is that we can actually dig in and show the reason behind something. So we can substantiate the figures, and we can also present potential actions that a user might want to take. So these are the potential decisions. And this is where bias comes in, and we need to we still as an industry still need to work through that and figure out how to suggest actions to a user that's not going to bias certain things and kind of steer them in the same direction the whole time. But for a dashboard to be able to start offering you actions that you can take is for me is really what these kind of systems should be. It shouldn't just be a dump of data on screen. Generating the UI is always going to be the easy part, and this top 2 points have been mentioned a couple of times. There's no point building these cool front ends if the underlying data is not trusted, or if you've got a whole bunch of systems. It's not enough to just enable MCP on all the systems and hope for the best. That's going to end up in something, but it's not going to end up necessarily in a good thing. We're big fans of MCP, but I do think you need to kind of temper the enthusiasm with some of the tech, and just kind of go to the point where you can get these proper semantic layers in place. Having governed data sources kind of touches on what I've said. The RAG sort of pattern seems to have kind of waned in enthusiasm, and it's a pity because I think there's a lot of good in there. But the problem with that is often around trust. There's no point showing a user some stuff, but it actually is not accurate. Monitoring is super important. And I'm talking specifically from these kind of systems as opposed to the sort of general Human in the loop when a decision has high consequence. I spoke about moving from high consequence work in Excel to some other system. If that other system is ungoverned and unmonitored, it doesn't help. We're kind of going from one extreme to the other. So human in the loop is still a factor. I often think in the data world we've too often forgotten about machine learning and data science as a practice, and we've all kind of jumped into believing that AI is language models. I'm going to blame the tech journalists for that one, and it's a pity because you can do really interesting work with more traditional data science, machine learning. The small language models, again, I think it's too easy to say, well, a language model is Fable 5 and we need to use that big thing. But the small language models can do really interesting work. Security and governance, we've spoken about those things, and I think there's a balance between putting security and governance in one bucket and the ability to experiment in the other bucket. And we've certainly seen a lot of teams veer off to the one extreme or the other. I don't know exactly where the balance is, but I do think it's not necessarily the one extreme or the other. It's somewhere there's a balancing act between the two. And in this kind of system, in a chat system where you're giving, where there's a degree of non-determinism, having the ability to run A/B tests, having the ability to have evals running the whole time, and obviously having guardrails in place is super important. And it's something that we've seen, just as an example, on the AWS or the Amazon Bedrock side, where they've now got CEDAR policies that can enforce kind of what gets called when you start calling tools. Super important. That's not quite guardrails, but it's in the similar sort of bucket. Kill switches, I think, are super important. That's something that probably should be in place anyway, and I view that as similar to guardrails in a way, is the ability to turn off a system when there's a problem. So if your HR system is not responding in a certain way within a certain threshold, there needs to be some automated way of switching off the connection between the HR system and the chatbot, just so it doesn't start giving leave to everyone or something like that. Logging is super important. Going through the list, it's almost done. I always chat to teams about how important logging is, but actually what's more important is to actually look at the logs. And I think those are two different disciplines. And the last one, which is going to feed into a lot of the data work that all of us do, is around this ubiquitous language. So you can't have a chatbot that thinks a customer is different to a client, is different to a end user, or whatever combination of things. There's got to be this ubiquitous language, and that really comes into how you've structured your data. Howard, shoot.
Yeah, I like what you're bringing out there. One thing I see is probably missing is the record of the evidence on what you based your decision on. So I like the logging, but we also need the ability to record that as a record, so that if people come back to us and ask questions on, well, how did you get here, whatever it is, that we can manage those as records and not ignore them and then get into trouble when it's not around.
Yeah, Howard, I think that's really important. And I think William or someone brought it up earlier on as well, is to get that proper sort of provenance of the data and the traceability of the decision. So what led up to it and things like that. We've got a test internally that we try and use with our clients, is around this sort of vanity project test. We don't call it that. We call it something more professional. But the idea is to make sure that we're helping customers make the right decision for the right reason. There's been a big push over the last sort of year or two around sort of AI, all the things for no reason, just to kind of tick a box with the Exco. And I'm sure we've all seen that. Probably a bunch of us have been involved in projects that are responsible for that. And this is our internal check to try and make sure that we're doing things for the right reason. And really the 3 points are, is this thing going to make us money? Is it going to save us money? Or is it going to save us time? And some combination of those three are really important. I've put a few more stats on the right-hand side, and I think a lot of these are really important to kind of keep in mind. The answer accuracy and the groundedness of the data, I think, was more or less what Howard was alluding to before, is kind of where did the answer come from, and kind of what underlying systems led up to that. And that's super important. Again, particularly if we're dealing with a system that's not completely deterministic. So that's kind of got us to the end. And I'm really interested. There's been a lot of feedback during the talk, which I appreciated. I'm interested to get a feel for where you think things are heading. This is really that sort of last mile of the data that a lot of us spend most of our time involved. But do we need more reports? Do more reports mean that they're going to get used more? Should we be having vibe coding in the boardroom so they can kind of make their own UI? I'm not too sure how I feel about that. That's certainly a thing. But yeah, that's me. Again, thank you very much for all the questions.
Thanks, Simon. Thank you very much. So maybe just to allow people to ask some questions. Bryant.
Yeah, one of the concerns I've heard from executives about using AI engines with data and decision making is, are they going to get the same answer each time they ask? And that consistency of the output, even if they rephrase the question a little bit, is a concern for executives because they want to be able to defend this. And they're going to go to a board or somebody else and say, I made this decision based on this, but I can't recreate that because every time I ask the agent, it gives me a different answer or something changes or evolves. So that's the concern I've heard from executives.
I'm hoping you're not wanting an answer from me, Bryant, because it's a really good question. I do think that if you've got an agent that's got free reign over a whole bunch of underlying systems, that the variance in answer is going to be significantly more than if it's got a very curated set of data to pick from. But yeah, it is still going to give some variance. But again, I'd like to think that if you've done all the work beforehand, before you start getting into discussion about whether it's a Power BI front end or it's a chatbot front end or a Slackbot front end, if you've done all that hard work, which again is what this organization does, there shouldn't be a lot of wiggle room for the agent.
I also think the semantic model is part of this key in terms of making sure we all have agreement with the terms that we use, the words that we use, and where the data comes from in terms of answering certain questions. And it's a little bit like what Power BI does now, is you can actually, of course, there's semantic terminology, but you can say, this visualization answers these questions. And you can build a series of questions. So any question coming from that will go to the same visualization. Not foolproof, but I think the semantic model is desperately trying to close that gap.
Which is a good thing for all of us, because I think the knowledge and the history of the last X decades of work that we've got, that's not getting thrown out the door.
Yeah, it's just I think what is happening is that we're just battling to get the enterprise semantic model working. We seem to be okay at individual reports, but getting the enterprise and all those elements linked up is where we're suffering at the moment. Shane, yes.
Yeah, I mean, isn't there a risk that we're trying to make a duck woof like a dog? So, the comment Simon made originally, well, I picked up on a while ago, was everybody thinks about AI as being LLMs, and we've had machine learning for years, right? And it is a form of modeling or models. And everybody's trying to get a probabilistic tool to become deterministic, where when we write code, it's deterministic. When we have a dashboard, it's deterministic. So while I see massive value in the probabilistic system and the natural language ask a question and the chatbot for ad hoc questions, right? For where there's a human in the loop, everybody seems to be trying to create semantic layers, context planes, metrics layers to force a tool that is probabilistic to pretend to be deterministic. Yeah, to force trying to, get a square peg in a round hole.
I think, as usual, the vendors have done a marvelous job of selling this to the execs, to the point whereby they think this is, just get rid of people, we can get this in, and effectively what they've done is they've made it impossible to walk this thing backwards. So the question is, how do we now funnel it forwards in such a way to try and bring some aspect of deterministic into it? And sometimes I look at decisions and I say, okay, a decision is valid provided I can confirm the time and the circumstances. And is there maybe an element of saying, yes, this was made by an AI agent, this was what I gave it, this is what it looked like at the time, and that was a decision I made on the day with this particular thing, and you time stamp it knowing that the next decision is going to be different. That may be some way into where we're going with this, but it's very murky waters.
Yeah, and we've had problems like this before. We have problems where people do data work or set up data projects with no governance. We have problems where people load data into a data platform with no quality or quality monitoring. We have ones where we roll out tools with no auditing and logging. And as data practitioners, it's been our job to say, hey, these are the foundational things that you need to do and we need to do to make data fit for purpose. And I'm kind of wondering why with the AI, LLM, Gen AI stuff, I'm not really seeing that from data practitioners.
I wonder if
Shane,
we haven't
maybe-
been snowballed.
Shane, maybe I can ask you just some clarity questions. I thought your initial, and maybe I got it wrong, but I thought your initial question is, why are we trying to get deterministic answers from a probabilistic system? Was that the question, or was there something else in that?
That was the original question, but it kind of will always go, whenever I start that question, it always
But I really like that first question, but of course, I think, and I'm sure Simon, I don't know whether you have an answer for that, or I mean, I've got some views, but Simon, how are you seeing it?
Howard, I'm keen to hear from yourself and others.
If I look at what's been happening, I think people love the conversation interface that Simon has spoken about. It's a lot easier to do that than to type and to click and to do this type of stuff, and then they don't find it. So lots of Power BI, they've been trying to put semantic models in to get the Q&A going, so that, and then the voice interface so they can ask questions. Unfortunately, with that type of thing, they're starting to get the different answers or the hallucinations. So I think the interface is the right interface. It's a lot easier for people to interact like that. But I think the credibility of the response is problematic. So I think we have to try to ensure that when people are asking questions about our data and about things that they want to make a decision on, we can't afford not to be having answers that will be consistent.
Yeah, I still feel like there's this balance. So we went from having dashboards that had 50 filters on it to drop down because we wanted it to be able to answer any question. Yeah, and so we kind of grabbed the wrong tool to solve that problem. So those ad hoc questions with a human in the loop, I see the value, right? Of being able to ask a question and get some data back and do that a lot quicker than overloading a dashboard. But if I consistently want to know what our revenue is for the month, then a dashboard that deterministically gives me that number, I still think is a better pattern than trying to force an LLM and natural language with semantic layers to consistently give us that number. I think it's that balance, right? I don't think we're skewing too much towards the cool new stuff.
Yeah,
I
think
stuff that actually is proven and has value.
I mean, I do agree with you that there are places and areas for dashboards and BI reports to operate in. I don't disagree, but there are certainly times where that data mart or whatever it is that we're looking at is being designed to answer a set of questions that are not applicable to all the questions. So, but we still have to give dependable answers back. And so I think when it comes to the numbers, we need to know that we're not, the engine is not hallucinating. The engine is not finding answers where it shouldn't be finding answers and failing quietly and going to the closest one. That I think we need the belts and braces to help with the conversation. I mean, I love the chatbot interface compared to having to try to get everything I need out of one or two dashboards or reports.
I think we also
and I think you had a second. Sorry, William.
Carry on.
There was two questions that Shane had, and I picked up on the first one, and I'm not sure whether I was clear on the second question that you had, Shane.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I had a question after the first question.
Okay, William.
Governance-wise, we still got the accountability resting with human beings, right? At this stage, we are not offloading that onto anything else, AI or whatever the case is. So that's always going to have to be the bottom line. If you can't give assurance as the human in that management position or whatever role you've been given in the company, if you can't give the assurances that come with that role, then there's a problem. And if you're going to use the AI for something, you're going to have to somehow show what you used it for, what the output was, and how it maybe supported your presentation of whatever you want to. So maybe you have deterministic information that gives you your numbers and all the rest of it, and then your AI helps you to formulate a really nice narrative that helps you to then present it or something to that effect. But then you have to declare that was done by the AI. And again, human has to be accountable.
And that's probably quite similar in a way to what the frontier models are doing with watermarking. So we might end up with an ability to say, well, this number came from a language model and not from a human.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure how to say your name, but Anai.
Yeah, that's correct. Thank you.
All yours, sir.
Great.
I was a little bit nervous there. Sorry about that.
No worries. Yeah, I was just listening to the conversation. I think it's really such a great conversation. But of course, admittedly, AI is a probabilistic engine of sorts. Of course, when we get answers from it for the business, we would expect it to be deterministic as well. So we should be able to predict what we're getting. But I think it's too early to try and get the best out of AI at this point. But yet also, I don't want to sound pessimistic about it. It's really an incredible, I think, piece of technology that we've got at our disposal. But of course, there are other mechanisms to try and improve what you're getting back from it. For instance, you can have, a set of templates. You can have your prompt templates that sort of guide it to some degree. Yet still, I don't think you can be 100% of what you get from it at this point in time. But the good thing is, every day it's getting better and better. of which I could assume that in the future, we're going to actually own the data. We're going to actually own the weights of that AI. So what I mean by that is we will be able to say, you take Kimi 3 and then pre-train it with your data, as well as allow it to learn as you use the application type thing in real time. So I guess it's just a matter of timing. If you ask me in the next 3 months, we could be actually talking of a totally different story altogether, But of course, the major issue that was raised earlier, or it's a fact actually, that the vendors oversold what AI can do to us at this point in time. But of which, if we were to look closely, you wouldn't really expect it to give you great answers because it's trained by general information from the internet. So how are we going to solve that? It's pretty much, of course, with the emergence of the new AI models that are open source, then we can actually take over it, train it based on our business needs, and then that will improve what we get from it, but not 100% because of the very nature of the mathematics that are, in play behind the scenes. But obviously, I think the future is super, positive with AI.
Sure. Great. Simon, any feedback on that?
No, I mean, I think that's spot on. I think we've got really great tools at our disposal, but I don't know if just using them all is a great option. But I also think that of sort of moving away from not using new tools is possibly also not a good option either. I think again, it's just making good decisions with what you've got at hand.
I think Batanai brings a really important point, is because we're going to open metric models and open source models, our ability to bring that type of model in and start building our own model certainly allows us to bring in more trust or more reliability as to how the answers are coming about. I think it is certain things of customizing what we need for our environment and not depending on external models that have been built outside. And I think we're seeing it a lot with, I was talking to someone who wants to set up a chatbot, and they said, it's great, but our problem is that we've got 11 languages and we need to support them all. And how do we do that with the existing models that we have? We're really suffering to get a reliable model. And there are problems with that in that situation. Mark, I see your hand up.
Yes, thanks, Howard. Sorry, my camera's not working at the moment, but I think that Batanai had his hand up before mine.
I think it's an old hand, but if you still have a question there, Batanai, is there a response or a question there? Okay.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
All yours, Mark.
Thanks so much. Let me put my hand down first so I don't fall into the same trap. Yeah. Thanks for the discussion, everyone. I think that there is a tendency to want to shirk responsibility for the tools that you choose. That leads one into a bit of a problematic space. I mean, if you zig when you should zag while building a pivot table, you can't point to Excel, as being at fault. So, I've personally adopted a kind of YOLO first approach when it comes to AI. I'm all in, and I want to see where I fail. And I think that the main thing that I've learned is that you have to adjust your relationship to failure and understand that you can do it really, really fast and recover. That's one of the propensities of the tool. So getting it right first time isn't necessarily the goal. And secondly, that if you're going to go into a generative space, well, you buy the ticket, you take the ride, simply put. If you need deterministic, then by all means use a generative platform to build deterministic software. But, it's generative or it's deterministic. Insofar as that's an axis that you can explore, it's only useful for building things. It's not useful for analysis.
Simon?
Yeah. Again, I think it's this talk was kind of pitched at a point where it, if there wasn't debate, then I would have failed. Again, I think we've got these interesting tools, and we need to be experimenting. And I think not to experiment them is going to be a fault. Just to sit back and wait for a big vendor to say this is the way. But you've got to be careful. But then again, I mean, we've seen terrible mistakes with relational databases. It doesn't mean that let's call it older technology is infallible.
Yeah.
There's still humans at play there.
Yeah, I agree strongly, Simon, and I really enjoyed your presentation, by the way. Just one more thing to mention is I think that there's also a tendency to, I don't know if anyone who's had a maize farm, but baboons can destroy a maize farm by grabbing one mealie and then putting it under their arm and then moving to the next bush and taking another mealie and then putting it under the same arm, and they drop the previous one when they do that. So they'll tear apart the whole crop and leave with one mealie. And if we're going to insist on trading out one tool for another, you've got to recognize that we're going to be in a similar position. So, and I have to be careful because I've been put my cards on the table here because I'm somebody who's really deeply invested in data visualization. So seeing dashboards go the way of the dodo has been tough for me. I feel like the guys who backed Silverlight must have felt. I wonder if there isn't a way to include a chat surface in a dashboard. Does it have to be chat or a dashboard? I can understand someone wanting key metrics delivered to them in a Slack channel. Makes total sense. And to be able to discuss that with an LLM also makes sense. But dispensing fully with the dashboard in favor of a tiny chat window, maybe not the best move. The same could be said for something like RAG, where Simon made a really good point here. If you look at RAG and the way that RAG has evolved recently, it does incorporate, old school, I'm doing inverted commas, you can't see my camera, ML, in the vectorization passes and the chunking and so on. So I think the best stack is the one that makes sense for you and incorporates as many things that are useful as possible. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. And I do know that, I've certainly enjoyed the team's interaction with Power BI dashboards and things like that, where people can annotate and discuss elements on a dashboard, on a Power BI report, and ask questions like, why is this happening? What's going on? And drill down. So I found that to be a great first step in terms of improving the conversation around a deterministic dashboard. And I suppose how that works now in terms of being able to have multiple conversations happening at the same time. I think it's a valuable exercise. William?
Yeah, I think that there's places at the moment where this really works well. In your innovation space, in your systems development lifecycle, in other areas like that. But I think when it comes down to business decisions, especially the high value ones, I think you have to make sure that your governance is in place. And that might for a while be, we've got to have proof and repeatability and all the other stuff that we've currently had. Notwithstanding your point, Simon, the SQL database can also go awry. And it seems that we have given business the ability to blame IT when the tool goes wrong. I'm not sure it's going to work so well when we try and blame IT for AI going wrong, because I'm not quite sure where that AI is going to sit. Is it going to sit in business? And then maybe they don't want to take that accountability. Or is it going to sit in IT and IT will control the AI and take accountability for the output? It will be interesting to see which way it goes.
Any response, Simon?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of, it's an old sort of adage of history repeating itself. And I think we're in another wave or another cycle of it. And the point from, I can't remember whether it was William or Mark, I do think it's not necessarily going to be one or the other. I don't think it's going to be like chat interface and nothing else, or dashboard interface and nothing else. I do think there'll be a combination. But I think it's maybe going to end up being the one helping the other kind of as the user kind of journeys towards a decision. And then maybe those sort of roles swapping out depending on the context of the user. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens. But I do think there's the shakeup is in progress, as with everything else because of AI.
Great, Simon. I think I've got one last question, and I'm always concerned with the vibe coding, and I mean, to me, it's also creating another form of Excel where people are building things and we're not sure what or how that thing is coming together. How the data models and the relationships and that are coming together when you do that vibe coding, and it's really difficult to see, well, what is the logic and what is the combinations that people have used when that app is generated. And I find quite a lot of the youngsters are jumping into the vibe coding, and do they understand the data model and the relationships and the hierarchies and things like that. So I am a little bit concerned that we're creating another Excel.
There's always going to be some version of some incarnation of Excel in the future. I'm sure there's going to be. I do think that the vibe coding concept is mind-boggling. I've been a career programmer for a long time for my career. I was going to say professional programmer, but I don't think professional is always the right term for me. And it's tricky to get into a position where the thing is making more code than anyone can review, and then you have another thing that's going to review that thing's code. That's a tricky thing. I do think what some of the vendors are doing on the Snowflake side and the Azure Fabric side is interesting, because you've then got this very curated model that the AI can latch onto and scaffold out a front end. So it's not building something kind of end to end. It's really that last mile before the user. So I think that the danger is less and less, because again, it's not just going into all of your source systems and kind of hoping for the best.
Yes, it's basically a vibe coding on a curated platform, not just
exactly. So I mean, it's the equivalent of having an Excel spreadsheet and then doing pivot tables, and that's not a good analogy, but I mean that's closer to the analogy than vibe coding from all the way into all of your source systems.
Yeah. Fantastic. Any last question? I'd like to sort of come to an end by past. William, I see you got a question there.
No, I just wanted to comment about a thought that crossed my mind with a lot of the conversation around Excel. I think that machine language to machines is what Excel is to human beings. It's somehow, we grew up with Lego, we got boxes in our minds, and we know how to work with blocks. And I think it's kind of a question in my mind how the younger generation maybe doesn't think that way. And I'm not quite sure how or where that's going to go to, but yeah, there you go. Brian, you've just come on.
Oh, sorry. I thought we were going to disparage Lego. I had to defend it.
Fantastic. Any last comments, last questions? Okay, great. Simon, thank you very much, sir. I appreciate the conversation, and I'm glad that you brought up some debates and some engagements. I think everyone enjoyed it. Thank you for your time.
Great. Thanks very much, Howard.